Hi guys, welcome back. Excuse the very gloomy weather and light today. I mean, we're the 31st of October, so it's kind of fitting. But today I want to share with you the books that I read during the month of October. And I'm going to start with the first one that I finished, which was a mystery novel, because I felt like reading something a bit spooky, and this came with a recommendation from Mara from Bookslikewhoa. She reads a lot of mysteries too, and she's a massive Agatha Christie fan, so if you are too, go and check her out. And she recommended this book because it's a closed circle mystery. So the premise is that people are stuck somewhere and there is murder going on. So the book I'm talking about is An Unwanted Guest by Shari Lapena. This is set on the East Coast of the United States, and it takes place in an inn which is snowed in because of the weather, and we have, I think, 8 guests who are stuck there, and as there is a power shutdown and things start getting a bit creepy, and it turns out the next morning that one guest has been murdered and pushed down the stairs. I really enjoyed the premise. I mean, I'm always looking for something that feels like And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, which is also a closed circle mystery set on an island. So I was going into this one feeling really hopeful. I enjoyed the mystery in general, and I thought the end twist was really good. It's a lot about the psychology of the people, which is something that you find also a lot in Christie. It's not so much about the plot, it's about people and finding out their motivations and what's going on in their heads. So this I really enjoyed. I just was really underwhelmed by the writing. It was really bland and kind of boring. Nevertheless, although I did enjoy the ending, it felt really rushed in the end. So these are like 2 critical points that I have towards this book, but it was really an enjoyable read. And if you feel like reading something spooky but a bit cozy also, I really recommend this one. Next up, I have a book that I read together with Jenny from Bookish Shenanigans. I'm gonna link her channel down below, go and check her out. We decided to read a historical fiction novel together, and that's The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gowar. I think this came out last year, and I've had this used copy for a while, and I was hesitant to pick it up, as I always am with historical fiction, because it's kind of hit or miss for me, but this sounded really interesting. And it's set in the 18th century in London, which is something that maybe is not represented so much in literature, especially in British literature compared to the Victorian time. And in this book we follow a merchant called Jonah Hancock, and the captain of his ship is coming back to London and announcing him that he sold a whole ship in exchange for a mermaid. And in parallel we also follow this courtesan called Angelica Neal. She is recently back in London too because her benefactor died, and we follow how the lives of these 2 characters intertwine. And there's also some elements of magical realism because of the mermaid side of the story. What I really enjoyed about this book is that it explores the lives of women in that time. It talks about how a woman can survive on her own, and it was very usually through prostitution. And what I really appreciated in this book is how realistically it was depicted. It really reminded me a bit of The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, which talks about women in Victorian times, but it really didn't shy away from the details and how lives really were. It also deals with class differences and also people's tastes for the macabre in that time, which I really enjoyed. I must say the writing is very lyrical. It's beautiful, but sometimes I did struggle with it because it felt really crafted in some way. And another critical point I have for it is that in the middle section of the book, the plot was meandering a lot. I didn't really know where it was going, and I did get bored in between, but nevertheless I really enjoyed learning about a time period I don't read about often and about an aspect of women's lives in history. And I thought it was just a perfect blend between historical fiction, obviously well-researched historical fiction, and a twist of magical realism. So if this is something that you enjoy, I really recommend picking it up. I just had a lot of fun with it, and it was just a perfect read for autumn. Next up, I read a graphic novel, and that is Nimona by Noelle Stevenson. This is a fantasy graphic novel, and it follows a young girl called Nimona who is a shapeshifter, and she goes and seeks out a man called Lord Blackheart, who is supposedly the villain in this story because she wants to be an ally to him and help him out in his evil plannings. And their goal is to unmask an institution in this fantasy world called the Institution of Law Enforcement and Heroics, and trying to show the world that these people are not the heroes they're saying they are. This is a really light-hearted book. If you look for something that you can read in one sitting and just have a bit of fun and escapism, I think it's perfect. I really enjoyed the art style and the choice of colors in this graphic novel, and like I said, it's just a really fun book to get sucked into for an hour or so. Nevertheless, it did disappoint me on some points. I was hoping more of a discussion about this duality between hero and villain, and I just really didn't get that, not as much as I hoped to. And in general, the story was kind of predictable, and the characters felt a bit underdeveloped. Although we only have very few main characters, I was hoping really more of a character development. And on top of that, the ending felt very rushed, and I just sat there having to reread these few pages because I thought I just didn't get it. So yeah, this was not so great. But overall, I think if you just want some fun fantasy, especially for younger readers, I think this is a great way to get a bit of escapism. So I'm still glad I read this, but I think this is definitely one I'm gonna pass on to someone younger I know, and just give it to them and hope they have more fun with it than I did. Next up is sadly also a slight disappointment for me. I got this book a long time ago, and I was keeping it for the gloomy month to read and to get a bit spooked, and unfortunately it didn't deliver that for me, and that is The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This is a novella from the 19th century, and it's supposed to be a ghost fiction. It's about this young governess who goes to this house in the British countryside and is going to take care of two young people, a boy and a girl. And after some time, she starts seeing this man and this woman that no one else is seeing. And she describes it to people around her, and it sounds like it's people that used to take care of the children before and are either dead or gone. Unfortunately, I don't have much positive to say about this. I'm really sad to say. I was so intrigued by the premise, and it just really didn't deliver on any level. The writing was really hard to get through, and I'm someone who reads quite a lot of classics through a wide variety of time periods, and this was just really hard to get through. I thought this was something that I just needed to get into a bit, and it's so short, and even halfway through I just was really struggling. The sentences are incredibly convoluted, and I know it's not only me, because as a non-native English speaker, because I then went and looked at some other reviews, and some native English speakers say the same things, so it's not only me. The writing is incredibly heavy-handed, and the characters were all so bland and undefined. I feel like maybe I'm missing something, and this is maybe one of those classics that you need to study and, you know, look into the symbolism of it all to really appreciate it for what it is. But just as someone who just wants to read classics because they're just normal books that were written a long time ago, and I just want to get some enjoyment out of them, I just didn't get that from that book, unfortunately. Thankfully, the next read that I got through was very, very, very good. And I'm so glad I got to it at last. And that is a short story collection by Daphne du Maurier called The Birds and Other Stories. This collection includes 6 short stories, and all of them are just so different. You have ghost stories, you have fairy tales with a kind of Lovecraft kind of cosmic horror twist, and some kind of post-apocalyptic fiction, and it was very varied. I never got bored at any point, and what all these stories do have in common is just masterful storytelling. Some of you might be familiar with the premise of The Birds, because you might have seen Alfred Hitchcock's movie, which I'm a big fan of. The story is slightly different, but the idea is still kind of the same. I don't want to give away any more than that about the other stories, because they all took me by surprise and I just loved it. So I think this is also one of these collections that you should really not know much more about it before going in. I think that's where you get the maximum enjoyment. All I have to say is that it's undoubtedly one of the best short story collections I've ever read. Yeah, I could go on about this one. I would also really love to talk about the stories themselves, but this would be really, really spoilery. But if you have read it and you want to chat about it, tell me, because it's so good. And if you want something spooky or gothic, just go for it. It's really, really good, even if you're not that much into short stories. Okay, next up, a bit of lighter reading, and that was the new Asterix and Obelix comic that came out this month. I've been reading these since I was a kid. I love them, and it follows these two ghouls who live in this village that are kind of making resistance towards the Roman invasion. And in this story, we follow them as they are entrusted with this young girl who is the daughter of the legendary Gaul chieftain Vercingétorix, because she is hunted down by the Romans, who basically want to assimilate her into Roman culture. And she is a teenager, so obviously you can imagine all the shenanigans that ensue. And it was just a really fun ride. I really enjoyed the last 4 of these comics, as at some point both the original author and illustrator passed away. There was a time in between where the franchise was not so good and they were trying to find that voice back, and I feel like they've found it back. The humor is there, the wordplay, and still it feels very current because they're kind of hiding in there some things that are happening today, some parallels, which is always fun to pick up on. So yeah, I really enjoyed this, and if you like these series, you can pick it up without hesitating because it's really fun. And lastly, the last book I finished was quite a chunker, and it was my one and single read that I read for the readathon of Victorian literature, Victober, and that was Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. I've always struggled with deciding which Charles Dickens book I would start with, and at some point I just got this book because I got it secondhand somewhere and never ever got to it. And this is the one that I had set myself to definitely get to this year, and I did, but I did switch to the audiobook version to read it, which was about 30 hours, so it was really a month-long read. This is about Amy Dorrit, a young woman who is born and raised in a debtor's prison called Marshalsea Prison in London, where she lives together with her father and her siblings. And on the other side we have Arthur Clenham, who is a merchant who recently came back from China. And these two characters are the pivotal characters around which all the other characters in this book revolve and how their lives intertwine. And at the same time, the book is, as you might expect from Charles Dickens, a criticism of his own Victorian society. He is making fun of the criminal justice system, but also of the bureaucracy. And ultimately, it's a book about making and breaking fortunes and how it's often very short-lived and insignificant. It's also about unrequited love and mental and physical imprisonment. I absolutely loved the themes that were addressed, and it was done in sometimes a very poignant way and sometimes in a very funny way. I thought most of the characters were very engaging, and I thought it was really interesting that some felt a bit like caricatures, but they were still so fleshed out that it was really effective in some way in getting to know them better and understanding their place in society. I did struggle a bit with his writing, and I don't think that's something unusual. He has a very convoluted way of writing things, and I think it did help me to read it through the audiobook because I didn't get stuck all the time at like sentences or pieces of sentences that I didn't fully understand. What I will say is that I feel like Maybe one or two of the subplots in this novel could have been cut out completely, if I'm being completely honest, because they didn't feel so important to the overall plot, and I think that also made the plot drag in some places. So I think this book could easily have been 200 pages shorter, but overall I'm really happy that I read my first Charles Dickens, and it's probably not going to be my last. I might need a bit of distance, but the characters were very endearing to me, and I really enjoyed following their lives and how their lives developed. And yeah, I just overall enjoyed the reading experience. Alright guys, these were the books I got to in October. I would love to know if you have read any of these and what you thought of them. If some of them sound like you would want to pick them up, tell me down below that I can tell you yes, 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 pick it up. Especially the Daphne du Maurier one. What have you been up to in October? What have you read? Tell me if you've read anything good that I might be interested in. I would also love some recommendations for the next Charles Dickens book I should read. And I hope you're doing well, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!